Should we start, Pratap, or yeah? Okay, let's start slowly until everybody starts coming slowly. Coming back. So last session, what we did, we tried to understand the size of the distribution, inequality, how spread they are. Now we are moving to poverty measurement. So we'll be using some of the concepts that we already used in the session. And based on this session, we will be building our sessions up until Friday. Okay, so our multidimensional stuff will be building on the conceptual aspects that we are going to cover here. Okay, you all had good lunch? Will you able to stay awake? Good. Great. So again, the same textbook that can be followed that I suggested for the previous session. So we have a lot of materials to cover in 2 hours. Let's see how the pace goes. But if I'm going fast, stop me, ask questions. I'm perfectly fine to respond to. Yeah. So to begin with, given that this is about energy poverty, why don't we start about asking why do we even care about poverty? Right? What evidence do we have globally that for some of you it may be natural, yes, we are doing poverty measurement, different kind of poverty measurement. Why? So why care? What is poverty? Now, poverty broadly can be seen as lack or absence of acceptable choices. Yeah. How do you see poverty? Let's hear from some of you. What do you think? What is poverty?
It's lack of basic amenities.
Basic
Lack
amenities.
of basic amenities.
Okay. Anyone else?
Deprivation of the basic amenities.
Yeah. So both of you. Deprivation of amenities. Anything else?
Inability to fulfill
One by one. Let's hear.
If we look at from Amartya Singh's angle, then it is deprivation of freedom and capabilities.
Okay.
Inability to fulfill basic requirements of survival.
Okay. Basic survival. Okay. So you are coming from basic needs.
Yeah, health, education.
Yes.
Obviously, like the same, but the perspective on the standard of living, if you are failing to maintain a minimum ideal standard of living.
And what is standard of living?
Just like to fulfill the basic needs and wants.
So you are coming back to basic needs.
Yeah.
So we all have to start from a fundamental place. Yeah. Glad to hear that you mentioned sense capability approach as well. So there are you can view poverty from lack of various things. Some may come and see lack of basic needs. Some may come and say lack of basic rights from human rights perspective. Same would come from a capability perspective, lack of freedom, lack of choices, and so on. Yeah, so if you take the broadest definition, it is going to be the lack of acceptable choices on a broad set of life decisions. That can be seen as poverty. Now, somebody may say that, look, we feel access to resources is the most restrictive. So I want to see poverty as lack of resources. Fine. You back to the realm of income poverty or consumption expenditure poverty, because this is what you do. If you are saying lack of basic rights, well, you have to define what rights, right to free speech, right to education, right to health, and so on. If you are talking about capabilities, you have to define the concept of capability, functionings, and so on in the sense what. Yeah. So if you look at the very broad definition, it could be seen as life decisions, severe lack of freedom to be or what you want to be. And but what happens is that in empirical work, whichever perspective we take, we typically end up in a multidimensional work. We quite typically end up with a similar set of indicators, but that does not mean that set of indicators, and I will cover it more on multidimensionality, it's rather than a choice, is more of a lack of data. Right? Because whatever data we have, we need to measure, right? We need indicators. And we generally do not typically have the data beyond certain indicators. So whatever perspective you start with, you typically end up with a similar set of indicators. But that does not mean the motivation has been the same. It can be very different. Yeah. Okay. So these are examples. It could be inadequate resources by necessity of life, cause of illness, early deaths, illiteracy, lack of education, mental and physical health, lack of opportunities, occupational opportunities. Yeah. Um, Lack of dignity, lack of respect from others. These are certain things that you do not find in typical data set. So they are not included. That does not mean they're not important, but only because there is no availability of data on them. Typical household service won't have data on these aspects. Yeah, they're not asked. Also, exclusion from community affairs, social exclusion. In Europe, for example, when they apply that multidimensionality, they generate a poverty measure for social exclusion. So the multidimensional measure concept is used, but as social exclusion. So whatever tools we are learning, now we will be talking about single dimensional measurement, but the same tools are applied elsewhere. It's just you are doing. So here you will be looking at energy poverty applications. Yeah, but the same tools can be applied elsewhere. Okay. There's some evidence how people at different level or at society, at international organizations, if you look at Millennium Development Goal from 2000, these many number of countries, they all came together and they agreed on some basic principles. Yeah. If you look at these G8 or G7 summits, they also talk about helping different, Asian Development Bank, African Development Banks, and so on. SDGs talks about reducing poverty and poverty in multiple dimensions. If you look at religious communities, you will see it is also embedded, helping the poor, helping the needy. Then you have cash transfer programs. So all these things evidence that societies, countries, international organizations, they care. Yeah. Now you may ask about some more fundamental question. You can see, but okay, why care about poverty alleviation? How does it affect society? We said it's fine, we care. But if we do not care, what could have happened? Or if we care, what could have happened? So if you look at individual perspective, people look at as a moral responsibility, a personal responsibility. Yeah, they talk about against fundamental injustice. Why should some people have but others won't have? It's an individual responsibility from everybody's perspective. If you look in terms of political leaders, so it can lead to social instability if you just leave it, too far. And if you can do it, it is also an indication of good governance. If you look at economics, poverty can be seen to us as a lost opportunity. Yeah, we all know that if you look at typical economic growth theories, they argue that it's not just physical capital, human capital, and labor. It's just ideas, the productivity that drives it, right? Where do ideas come from? Ideas do not fall from sky. Ideas come from us, people. Now, when will we be generating ideas properly? When we are in good health, when we have good education, and so on. That directly means, yes, you have to reduce poverty. You cannot. So you reduce poverty, that means you are increasing the potential of further development of ideas that will drive the future development and future growth. It's at the heart of it for us, economists. And of course, for business leaders, you will see a lot of innovative ideas they will try to do to catch the bottom of the pyramid. So everybody has incentive to work and reduce poverty. Now, then, as you said, poverty can have a general form of general poverty, but then we can have typical particular types, energy poverty, there could be health deprivations. You can even create a multidimensional measure of health only, because health deprivation is also multifaceted. Same with energy, anything, yeah? Okay. So why we start with monetary tools for monetary poverty or tools for single dimensional poverty is that monetary dimension is not the end in itself, but it is an important dimension. As an economist, I cannot ignore the value of money. So money could be necessary, but it's not sufficient for higher well-being. Even if we have money, there could be lack of other aspects. Money is an important one, but it's not an end in itself. It's a good means. Yeah. And also, the monetary poverty literature is the most well developed because the variables are cardinal. It's really you. It's a perfect world to develop your tools and everything. We'll learn those tools, but then we will be whatever we are learning, we'll be using them over the next 3 days. Yeah, to go into multidimensional poverty world. Okay. So again, we'll start with the CDF. I have already seen you. Now let's closely look at how CDF is linked to poverty. I have discussed very briefly, but let's look at it directly. So we have this cumulative distribution function. Yeah. Question is, what does it tell us? So it tells us the share of the population having income less than a particular level. Here you have level. So this is 4 unit of income, 8 unit of income. Okay. So fx4, according to 4, you have fx4. fx4 is the share of population having income less than 4. Is there any term that we use? Have you heard of proportion of people below a poverty line? What is it called? Head count ratio. Interesting. So a distribution function is basically the head count ratio curve. So it gives you the head count ratio, the proportion of poor people for every possible poverty line. Interesting. This is how cumulative distribution is related to poverty analysis. This direct link. If you take F8, so for 8, if 8 is your income, then F8 is the proportion of people below the income of 8. Directly linked. Make sense? Why we are moving from quantile function to distribution function? Because it's directly linked to poverty. Okay. How should we assess poverty? Now, in general, in the poverty literature, and you will see when I talk about multidimensional poverty, you will see that there are different branches of poverty measurement that grew independently. We'll talk more about it. Yeah, but they all start, there's a common ground to start, and that was same. Okay, so since 1976, many streams have developed separately, but they all started from there. Now, there, Sen talked about 2 different steps for defining a poverty measure. The first one is called identification, is very important. Second one is aggregation. Now, identification answers to the question, who is poor? Okay. So it discerns from the poor and the non-poor, because if you're designing a policy, you need a benchmark. Okay. And that to be able to identify, these are the group of people that I will be focusing on. That means you need to identify the group of people. Yeah. And this is done mainly by a tool called a poverty line. And that's why a poverty line becomes important. Yes, it is arbitrary, it has arbitrariness, it is crude, so on and so forth. There are various criticisms. If you set a poverty line, everybody will ask, why this poverty line? Why not something else? Fine, but no one can ignore the role of the poverty line. So, a person is poor if the achievement is below the poverty line. It could be income, it could be education, it could be health, however you define it. What is the significance of poverty line? 2. Number 1, targeting. Unless you have identified a group of people, who will you direct your policy to? That's why poverty line is so important. So you need to be able to target. Number 2, benchmark. How much income would you give it to the poor? If it is a cash transfer program, how much income are you going to the poor? £1 million, £1 million rupees suddenly? But government has limited resources. How much? How do you do your budget? So you need that benchmark. So these are the 2 reasons why poverty lines are important. Yeah. Now it can be debated. There is no scientifically valid way to set a poverty line. I have not come across any. You can tell me if you have any, if you are part of any. There is no scientifically one robust way to say this has to be a poverty line. No. Whatever you do, somebody will ask the question, why? And you have to defend. Okay. So, technically, what we generally do. So, to do as benchmarking, we will have a distribution. But from the distribution, we'll be generating something called a sensor distribution. Have you heard about sensor distribution, truncated distribution? Have you heard? Can anyone tell me what is the difference between censoring and truncation?
The truncation has a upper limit and lower limit. That's what you can see.
So truncation means if you do not need some observations beyond a particular threshold, you drop them. Yeah? But for censoring, you do not drop them. You replace those additional values with a threshold itself. Okay? So, if you have a distribution X, then we will be denoting the sensor distribution as X star. So we will be retaining the original values Xn if Xn is less than the poverty line threshold. We're denoting the poverty line by Z, right? But if the values are greater than equal to Z, we are going to just replace them by Z, assuming they have reached the threshold. So in a way, what we are saying we are not going to care about the income that is above poverty line. Because why do we need that? But if we drop them, we will have different problems. I will tell you that later. So, an example, if you have a poverty line of 10 and your original distribution is 4, 8, 9, and 15, so this is the income that is above the poverty line. We do not need to care about this person. But we are not dropping that person from the sample. We are just replacing it by the poverty line itself. Done. Yeah? So graphically, how do you do it? Suppose you have, this is your distribution, right? Cumulative distribution. And this is your poverty line, Z. What we are going to do, we are going to censor. How do you do that? We are saying, done. So all the income above Z is replaced by Z itself. So you are censoring. So that part is gone. All the incomes above the poverty line, they're ignored. As if our objective is to benchmark, to bring everybody to the poverty line. That's the need for a policymaker, right? You have to bring those people at the poverty line. That's you have set the benchmark. So you're saying these people have reached the benchmark. So there you go. Their income is replaced by the benchmark. Yeah. So what would be an ideal distribution? The aim is to draw everyone at or above the poverty line. That should be the role of a policymaker who is designing anti-poverty programs, right? So the ideal distribution should be, this should be the ideal distribution. This is what you want. Once you have set the poverty line, you want everybody to be either at the poverty line or above. So this is your ideal distribution as a policymaker. And we'll be using this notation because I'll come back to it. We'll be saying it as X bar Z star. Everybody, this is the ideal distribution that is set in front of a policymaker. This is what you have to achieve. Agreed? Everybody? Does it make sense? Yeah? So this is going to be your ideal distribution. A policymaker has to achieve this distribution. This is the target. This is the benchmark. Sounds good? Okay. Now, the question is aggregation. Once we have identified using a poverty line who are poor, who the poor people who are subject to be targeted, then we are going to ask, okay, how poor is the society? One measure you already know called headcount ratio, right? You just say what fraction of people are poor. This is widely reported. Like, what is the fraction of $1 a day poor? What is the fraction of people in say 30 rupees per day and so on? Right? Okay. So we are technically we are going to construct a poverty index summarizing the information in the censored achievement vector, because we are not going to be we are not going to care about the income of the non-poor. So we will just be caring about the income of the poor. So censored distribution, not the original distribution. Now we will be denoting the poverty measure either by EXZ or by TX star, however you define, however you express, it doesn't matter, because X star is created using Z. So it could be either PXZ or PX star, it doesn't matter. Okay. So what we will do, just like we did for inequality and achievement standards, we will be denoting some of the good properties that a poverty index should satisfy. Yeah. And then we will see how these poverty measures also can be expressed as twinning achievement standards. We'll show you. Okay, let's talk about the desirable properties, but I'm presenting them just in terms of examples because you already have seen how they look like technically. So symmetry, same, but note for all the properties you have this extra term here, Z here, because you need that poverty line. So again, if you have these income vectors, if you just switch people's achievements, overall poverty should not change. Yeah. Then population invariance, same thing. If the poverty line remains unchanged, you simply replicate people's incomes, same poverty should not change. Normalization, if there is no poverty, poverty is zero. Yeah. Scale invariance, if you have, say everything is expressed in dollars, poverty line in dollar, you express everything in pounds, poverty line in pounds, poverty should not change. And this is the only acceptable argument in favor of using scale invariance. Remember, scale invariance takes you to, in inequality world, it takes you to the right wing view. Yeah. Monotonicity, the idea is that if everything else unchanged, same poverty line, if you have an improvement in the income of a poor person, should poverty increase or decrease? What would you expect? Everything else unchanged, increase in a person's income should reduce poverty. Okay, that's monotonicity. Transfer principle works here, but I will talk about it a bit more over the next few days. It comes from sense idea. If you take these two distributions where the average income among the poor, all these four people are poor, right? Because the poverty line is 10. So all of them are poor. But here you see 1199, here you see 44 and 66. So the average income of the poor is exactly the same, but this one is more unequal than the other. And according to Sen, this should reflect higher poverty. But there are two different perspectives when you are, talking about this thing. Sen talks from an egalitarian perspective, that income among the poor has to be equal. But there is also another perspective, it's called prioritarianism. That means who should be prioritized first. In most cases, this prioritarianism and egalitarianism, they typically need to be on certain principles. But this is more of an egalitarian perspective, but personally, I like the prioritarian perspective, where you are saying if a person is poorer, should get more attention than less poor. But they mostly, these different rules, they agree with each other. Okay? Now, this particular property is very much in the heart of poverty measurement. It's called focus. The idea is that, look, what is the difference between these two distributions? The income of this person increased, right? But is this person poor?
No.
So focus property says if there is an increase in a non-poor person's income, poverty should not change. This is exactly related to the censoring that we did. That means if there is any increase in a non-poor person's income, we are not going to count it. So focus, you will not see focus in inequality or income standard. Focus is related to poverty measurement. Additive decomposability. Now we talked about decomposability in inequality, right? What was that? Between group and within group, sum. Decomposability in poverty is different. Please be very mindful. Do not get confused between inequality decomposition and poverty decomposition. Inequality decomposition, it was within plus between. Poverty decomposition requires that if you have, so I think I've a little bit more notation. Yeah. So if you have, suppose, two different groups, men and women, male and female, or different states and so on. So this is the poverty among males, say. This is poverty among females, right? Overall poverty should be expressed as population share of male times their poverty, population share of female times their poverty. That's called decomposition or additive decomposability in poverty world. There is nothing between or within here. Poverty decomposition is just that if you have the poverty of different groups, then overall poverty should be just the population weighted sum of this subgroup poverty. Okay, so it's different. There is a difference between inequality decomposition and poverty decomposition. Is very crucial. Poverty decomposition just is this one. There is no between group poverty or within group poverty. Okay. Please understand this one because we'll be coming back to it on Wednesday and Thursday as well. Yeah. Okay. Now, twin standard representation. It turns out, just like inequality, most poverty measures can also be written as, if you have a higher achievement standard B and lower achievement standard A, then most poverty measures can be written as B minus A over A. As simple as that. So all these complicated poverty measures will be showing some of you. They all can be written with this particular form. Now, in this form, the higher income standard is the arithmetic mean of, do you remember this vector? This is the ideal vector. That means this is equal to z for everybody. That means this is the ideal distribution where everybody is at the poverty line. So if I take an average of the distribution, what do I get? I get the z itself. Okay? So it is the z value itself. And the lower achievement standard will vary. And depending on what lower achievement standard we use, we will be getting a different poverty measure. Yeah? So these are common poverty measures that are used. Head count ratio, you all know what head count ratio is. Poverty gap measure. Have you heard about the gap measure? Poverty gap, some of you did. Okay, we'll talk about it. Then there are other measures such as square poverty gap. There is something called Sherlock and Thorne measures, Watts measure. We'll talk about it, and some of them are currently used by the World Bank as well. They're doing some new poverty measurement as well. Okay, so let's talk about head count ratio. This is the most well-known poverty measure. Many of you have used it sometimes in your life, yeah? So it is simply the proportion of poor people below a poverty threshold. So if the total number of population is N and the number of poor is Q, then the head count ratio is simply Q over N. Yeah, let's try to see in terms of graph how it looks like. So we start with the distribution. Yeah, we do first censoring. That means we censor at the top. So this is what we get, right? Now we introduce something called doubly censored. We censored twice. We censored at the top to get the censored distribution. Now we are going to censor at the bottom. Let's see how it works. That's called twice censoring, so doubly censored, right? This is how it goes. So if the incomes are above Z, equal or above Z, we replace by Z. And if the incomes are less than Z, we replace by 0. Okay, how does it look like? This is how the distribution, a doubly censored distribution, look like. Okay, I'll show you a funny thing. Yeah, what it is. So we are going to denote it by 2 star. Yeah, it's in double star. Okay, very good. And it turns out this one we already showed. This is equal to Z, right? This is the ideal distribution, Z. So average is Z. So this is Z, this is Z and Z, right? They cancels out, we get a 1. This one turns out it's the average, but of this double star. And I'm going to show you this is equal to Q over N. Would anyone like to do the maths by themselves, or would like me to do it for you? Why don't we do it together? Why don't you try to solve this one? So this one you know already Z. This is Z. This is Z, and this one is just the weighted average of 0 and Z. Try it and see. You get Q over M. I'm trying to solve over here as well. Sure. And so look, what we have Z minus, this is what you have to do, right? We had Q number of 4, right? So we should have Q number of zeros and N minus Q number of Z. So we are going to have here Q number of zeros plus N minus Q number of Z. Agreed? And it's divided by Z. Yeah? So we are going to have Z minus, this one goes, this is 0, and this is N minus Q times Z. Yeah? So minus N minus Q times Z over Z. We are missing something? Yeah, we are missing something. We are missing something, which is the entire thing. This entire thing has to be divided by something, right? Because it's the average. So this is actually, this has to be an N. So the entire thing has to be divided by N. So here is the duster. So this is going to be N minus Q over N times Z. Agreed? They all cancel out. So you just have 1 minus N minus Q over N. Agreed? Yes or no?
Yes.
So you have equal to N minus N plus Q over N. This is equal to Q over N. Okay? Do we all agree? So here, just write, this is Q times 0 plus N minus Q Z divided by, yeah? There should be an N here, I just wrote here. The N should be here. Yeah, this is that. So this is you get, so you, in terms of the figure, you saw, if you just do this 2 censoring, that means you are giving all the 4 a value of 0, all the non-4 a value of Z. You take just the average and use this simple formulation. This is nothing but the headcount ratio. The question is, what's the problem with the headcount ratio? Fine, it's easy to calculate and so on, easy to understand. So here you have 4, 8, and 15, Z equal to 10. Of course, what is the headcount ratio? 3 over 4. Yeah? Okay. Now let's talk about the problem with the headcount ratio. Very easy to understand. You talk to anyone, they will understand. We talk to our grandmas, they will understand what headcount ratio is. No mathematics needed. Let's run an exercise. Yeah? So suppose you have this distribution, and this is the poverty line. How many people are poor?
All four.
All 4 of them? Yeah? Suppose you are the economic advisor of policy. Yeah? He gives you 10 pounds to help the poor and said, you know what? You assist the poor with the 10 pounds. In the next period, I will assess how well you did using the headcount ratio. How do you distribute the money?
So we first put the 9 5 so that 2 people came out of the board.
Okay.
Rest they will distribute money.
So just to repeat, you will give 1 to this person, 5 to this person, and distribute the rest between these 2. Okay. So you will reduce your headcount ratio by half. It was 100%, you will reduce to 50%. Anyone else?
And change the poverty gap ratio, will check
No, I'm saying head count. Why are you going to gap? I mean head count what, man? No. So head count. So any other suggestions?
You can give 10 rupees to 3 people. Bring them open.
How? So
One to last people, 5 to the secretary.
If you it doesn't, right? Okay. Any other suggestions? Can you do any better as an economic advisor? No? Okay, here's my suggestion and see how you feel about it. Okay? I give £1 to this person, I give £5 to this person, and I keep £4 to my pocket. Any different? So headcount ratio can lead to corruption. Policymakers won't have to spend the entire money. Still, they can show they have actually done a pretty good job in terms of reducing poverty. Okay? That's the catch. Also, they have other issues, but this is one way of seeing it. Yeah? Now, we will see. So, I didn't have other examples because of the shortage of the time. Also, think about if you have an increase of say £1 of this person, income goes from £1 to £2, is there any change in headcount ratio? So it violates the property. That property is called monotonicity. So you work very hard, you improve the situation of some people who are really poverty stricken. They're better off. They didn't come out of poverty, but they're better off. And at the end of the day, World Bank or IMF who gave you the loan tells you you haven't done anything. Your headcount ratio was 20%, it's still 20%. So you can see, even, I'll come to that, even with, so technically you can understand, oh, it doesn't satisfy monotonicity, but what is the policy implication? That is the policy implication. Yeah? Yes.
So that example you gave, you said that $1 to be given to the person having 9 pound and 5 to the person having 5 pound. So if we do this, $4 is given to the person having $5 and 1 to the person having 9. Then how does the person with $9 and $10 are different from each other? They are not significantly different. Right?
I gave 1 to this person,
5 to this person, these two people, individuals. If we give them amount, which would mean that one is above just above poverty with £10, and the other one is at $9, just below the poverty line.
but I'm giving £5 to this person.
4%, 4 pound. In case you give them that person 4 pound,
Yeah.
then it means that he'll be having 9 pound, right?
Yes, so what is your headcount ratio? Suppose I give
My head count is 10. I mean 10 is the poverty line.
no. If I give £1 to this person and £4 to this person, what is the poverty headcount ratio?
25%.
You gave £1 to this person, so out of poverty.
Yes.
You give £4 to this person.
But that's these two individuals, one with less, the one with having 9 pound is not significantly different from the person having 10 pound, right?
But our question was, I am the policymaker, I am the economic advisor, and somebody has asked me to do maximum reduction in headcount ratio from my side. I'm not thinking about from the people's side. Somebody may say, why are you giving them at the poverty line? Why are you not giving another £2? But I am thinking from the point of view of the economic advisor here. That's a different issue where we'll come to that later. We are not talking about that. I am saying, if I follow the rules, then I have to reduce headcount ratio, the maximum amount. I have no incentive to spend that extra money after I bring these two people out of poverty. Or some of you should have asked me, why are you not giving that money to the poorest of the poor? Because this is where we should help them first. But the headcount does not give us any incentive. So which measure you use for your policy change the incentives of the policymaker. And that's where you hit the policy. That's where measurement is so important. If you do not measure properly, you do not give proper incentive and it can distort. So first of all, it can raise corruption. Second, there is no incentive to help the poorest of the poor. You just take these two least poor out of poverty, fine, voila, your job is done. That's where we are going to go next. Does it make sense? Okay. Next, let's look at the poverty gap measure. What problem can that poverty measure, this particular poverty measure, solve? So what we do here, instead of just converting them to 0 and z, we are not looking at 0. Instead, we are computing something called normalized gap. How far below the person, a poor person, is from the poverty line? So z minus xn star over z. Now see, I'm using xn star. So those who are not poor, their value is already becoming 0 because they are getting the value of z, right? Z minus z over z is 0. So now we are looking at those who are poor, they have normalized gap, normalized shortfall. This is what we are going to call it. And those who are not poor get a value of 0. Yeah. And then this is the distribution. So this is gap for the innate person. So these are, we have few poor people. So this is the vector of this normalized gap. All lie between 0 and 1. Yeah. Larger gap, that means larger the value over here. Then we construct something called an income gap. What is income gap? This is just the average of all the normalized gap among the poor. The problem is that this is not a poverty measure. Because if a less poor person becomes non-poor, this particular amount increases. So this is not a poverty measure itself. Poverty measure is the head count ratio multiplied by the income gap. That's the poverty measure. So please never use this as your poverty measure because this is only focused among the poor. And it can go up when a poor person becomes non-poor. You have to use this one, which is PH times PH. Okay? Is an example. If you have this as your vector, then of course 3/4 of the population is poor. You compute this GQ, which is only for these 3 people. This is 0.6 because it's 60% below the poverty line. This is 0.2 because 10 minus 0.8 over 10 is 0.2. Then 10 minus 9 over 10 is 0.1. You take the average, you get 0.3. You multiply it by the head count ratio, you get 0.225. What does it solve? Head count ratio was only looking at whether you are poor or not. In gap, you are saying how far below you are the poverty line, that matters. That will solve our problem. The policymaker is not going to waste the money or do corruption with the money because every single penny you spend on the poor people, it will be reflected in your gap. It will reduce the gap. So one problem can be solved. Yeah. Now it turns out poverty gap can also be presented as this is it minus, in this case, it is the average of the sensor deprivation vector itself, the entire sensor deprivation vector. Yeah. If you do that, divide by z. So this is what it becomes: 1 minus the average of the sensor deprivation vector divided by z. That's your poverty gap. Yeah. Let's look at an example. So suppose you have the same vector, then your x star is going to be 4, 8, 9, and this one will be replaced by 10. There you go. You take the average, you get 7.75. Then your 10 minus 7.75 over 10 is equal to 0.225. This is what we got in the previous slide. So either way you compute, you get the same values. Yeah? The two different ways of seeing the poverty gap. Okay. How is it effectiveness? Well, of course, if you have these same idea, you have all 4 people as 4. Now again, I ask you to distribute 10 pounds. How do you distribute the 10 pounds? This time. Yeah, but how would you? What would you do? Yeah, go ahead.
We put with 1 pound to person having 9 pounds,
Mhm.
then to the 5-pound person,
Okay.
and then to the third pound.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone else?
Will give 1 pound to that 9 pound person and 9 pound to that 1 pound person.
The last.
Interesting. Okay. Anything else?
But sir, the poverty gap measure will not have that to give it to the 1-pound person.
So it will be.
But what incentive do you have? Why your rule is better than hers?
Because you have to close the gap. See,
But she's closing the gap
to
too.
reduce the poverty of the person owning 1 pound, you require more.
How much gap did you reduce? 10. How much gap did she reduce?
But still,
No. How much gap did you reduce? 10. How much gap did she reduce? What is the difference?
still that the first person owning the 1 pound is very far away.
But who cares? You reduced a gap of 10, she reduced a gap of 10. Why is your better than hers? Here is the clue. It does not matter. It does not matter who you give the money to. As long as any poor person income does not go above 10. You hold them to poverty line. Even if no one comes to the poverty line, suppose I give 5 to this person, 5 to this person. Does it make any difference? I reduce the gap by 10. So you are right. You are right. Poverty gap, as long as you are reducing the gap, it does not matter who give you the money to. But what you may say, sir, what incentive is required so that a policymaker will help this person first? Poverty gap doesn't do that. So poverty gap does not give any incentive to help the poorest of the poor first. That's the catch. Otherwise, however you distribute, it doesn't matter. She was a benevolent policymaker. She said, I'll help at least the poorest. You said, you know what? Probably they are my friends. I will help these guys first. However you do, but there's no incentive. But you both are right. Do you see the point? Okay. So, would the policymaker necessarily assess the poorest of the poor first? Poverty gap does not allow that incentive either. So headcount and poverty gap, none of them give incentive. Poverty gap solves the problem of corruption that I gave you, because you are reducing, you are spending at least the entire money, but it still does not help the poorest of the poor. What should we do? What incentive is required? Additional incentive. Yeah. Only the measures that satisfy the transfer principle would provide the incentive to assist the poorest of the poor. In your exercise, I have added a question for this evening. Please try to go through that exercise. Yeah. So what is Foster Greer Thorbecke family? Some of you may have heard FGT, F for Foster, Greer, G for Greer, T for Thorbecke. They developed these measures in 1984. What the idea? The idea is, of course, you start with the normalized gap. Yeah. It also has this parameter like alpha, as you saw in Atkinson's measure. Yeah. But FGT as a family with alpha is 1 over n. Then you get the sum only among the poor, but you do normalize gap to the power alpha. Okay, so this is what FGT family is. For FGT family, when alpha equal to 0, this FGT family becomes the headcount ratio itself. When alpha equal to 1, FGT becomes the poverty gap measure itself. When it's alpha equal to 2, it becomes the square poverty gap measure. Remember, we're talking about Euclidean mean square. This is another application. So what they do, so for FGT2, this is equal to 2. Now, what is the intuition? It is multiplying the gap by itself. So larger the gap, you are multiplying with a larger value. Smaller the gap, you are multiplying with a smaller value. So it's another weighted sum where the higher poverty values are multiplied by itself. So you are giving more weight to the poor than the less poor. That is the idea. Yeah. So square poverty gap. Now it is decomposable, it's sensitive to transfer, it can be broken down into this headcount ratio, income gap, and again they use generalized entropy too among the poor. I'm not going to do decomposition too far because it will again take 10-15 minutes to go through. The problem is that in general, and many people say it's not a big problem, in alpha was an inequality aversion parameter, and they were all linked. Geometric mean is less than arithmetic mean, harmonic mean is less than geometric mean. Here, a change in alpha is not as intuitive. You cannot compare gap with square gap and so on. That particular link is lost. That is the only problem with this measure. Okay? And it sometimes becomes really difficult to intuitively interpret its measure. Head count, you have intuitive interpretation. Gap, okay, how much money is needed to get the people out of poverty? Square gap, very hard to find an intuitive interpretation. That's the only disadvantage. Okay, now I'm presenting the entire snapshot of all the poverty measures. Look, they all can be written as somehow a function of this Z and another income standard. So they all look like this. And now we have done poverty gap measure, fine. There is something called a Watts measure. This Watts measure is very similar to generalized entropy. Yeah, this is called LNZ, the natural logarithm of the poverty line, minus the geometric mean here. It is the geometric mean on the center headcount ratio. This is a measure. It is considered. I'll show you the properties. One of the perfect measure, and World Bank is trying to use it to define their own poverty measure. This is an attempt going on since 2023, 2024. Yeah. Then SST measure. Well, this is same Sharok and Thorn measure. Also, this just simply applies same mean on this particular sensor, the achievement vector. So you can see they all are very simple in that sense. Once you know income standard or achievement standards, you just apply the same tool to create inequality measures, to create poverty measures. They all are linked. They're all integrated with each other. Once you understand the achievement standards, rest are just easy. And similarly, there is another called Chakrabarty, Hemming and Wolf measure. This is also, you apply is 1 minus, but here you just used generalized mean of value alpha. I showed you the generalized mean as, generalized mean. So you use the generalized mean and alpha, and there you go. So all of these measures, except for the squared gap measure, which does not have a twin standard representation, rest of them are just as simply presented like twin income standard. That's it. Okay. I'm not going to each measure one by one, but very quickly, these are the properties that they satisfy. Headcount ratio doesn't satisfy monotonicity and transfer, and you saw the policy implications of that. Poverty gap measure does not satisfy transfer principle. So no incentive to assist the poorest of the poor first. Rest of these measures, they do. So you can see the squared gap, wards, they satisfy almost all properties over here. SST, Sen, Sharok, and Thorn, given that it is based on same mean, it does not satisfy additive decomposability and subgroup consistency. Yeah, it inherits from Gini and same mean. And CHUC satisfied for their different parameters. This is a bit complicated one, but some of them satisfy additive decomposability, not all, and some of them satisfy transfer principle. Yeah, but these two are kind of perfect measure from your policy purposes. Okay. Okay. How am I doing, Pratap, in terms of timing? Perfect. Okay. Any questions so far? Any clarifying questions so far? Whatever I said, did it make sense? Anything completely confusing? Not yet? Okay. So I am carrying on, but if you have issues, please stop me and ask questions. Yeah? I'll try to go a bit fast. So we are moving into the realm of now dominance and ambiguity. Yeah? So there could be two types of issues here. unlike in case of income achievement standards and inequality, here there could be arbitrariness from the point of poverty line. Whatever, if you choose $1 a day, some people will say, what is the difference between $1.2 a day and $1 a day? Same thing. Aggregation, poverty measure, because if you use square poverty gap, somebody would say, why not use wards? If you use wards, somebody says, why not use poverty gap? Will you get different ranking? So again, can we devise a situation where we do not have to choose a poverty line, not a poverty measure? We can just say poverty has gone down. Whichever measure you choose, whichever poverty line you choose. That's called dominance and unanimity. Yeah. So just to give you an example, not rocket science, it's very easy. Does the choice of poverty line alter the ranking? Yes. Let us consider these two distributions. Yeah. If your poverty line is z equal to 7, you have first distribution with 1/4 headcount ratio, second distribution with 2/4 headcount ratio. Do we agree?
Yes.
Now suppose poverty line is changed to 10. Do we have the same ranking that society Y is more poor than society X? So you change the poverty line, your poverty ranking is changing. Not robust. Yeah. Similarly, what about all poverty measures? Again, take the same example. Again, if you choose poverty z equal to 10, X has higher poverty than Y. Agree? Right? You take poverty gap, ranking reversed. Y is more poverty than X now. So you can see changing the poverty line, changing the poverty measures can change the direction of comparison. So can we devise a situation where we are able to say, no matter what, if you have that situation, you don't have to even compute poverty measures. Yeah. So variable line poverty measure in general, poverty ordering mainly focused on the identification. Yeah. And variable measure poverty ordering is related to aggregation. Yeah, but we'll try to provide one solution that should take care of all of them. Okay. Now let's look at poverty incidence curve. Many of you may probably expect what this incidence curve is going to be about, which the curve that gives poverty incidence, the curve that gives poverty rate. You already know this is going to be the distribution, CDF, right? So the CDF is the poverty incidence curve itself. So suppose now you have this cumulative distribution function, yeah, fx. And then you have a second cumulative distribution function, fx prime, red and blue. You take the poverty line Z. Which distribution has higher poverty, higher headcount ratio? Red or blue? Red has higher headcount ratio. How do you compute higher headcount ratio from a poverty incidence curve? Is the height of the curve that gives you the headcount ratio. So blue has higher headcount ratio. So if you do that, this is the headcount ratio for the red for poverty line Z. This is the headcount ratio for the blue for poverty line Z. So blue has higher poverty in terms of headcount ratio, right? What about for poverty line Z prime? Which distribution has higher poverty? Again blue. What about Z double prime? Is there any poverty line at which fx has higher, red has higher headcount ratio than blue? No. So no matter what poverty line you choose, blue has higher poverty than red. Now this is very similar to the quantile function. One was above the other. In case of distribution, one is to the right of the other. So whichever distribution lies to the right has lower poverty. Whichever distribution lies to the left has higher poverty. Always try to remember this figure because people always get confused. People always keep on thinking, oh, For quantile function, the above one has higher income standard. So that means to the right will give higher income standard. No, it's the other way around. Sorry, the right one will give higher income standard, but high poverty in poverty world is the left one which has always higher poverty. Is that okay? Okay. So fx lies nowhere to the right of fx, then x prime has no lower head count ratio than x for each and every poverty line. So if you just plot these two curves at the start, whenever you have the data set, you just plot these two curves and you get this kind of relationship. It doesn't matter actually which poverty measure you use. For head count ratio, definitely it doesn't matter, right? This is called the first order stochastic dominance. So initially I wrote the first order stochastic dominance in terms of quantile functions. One is inverse of the other. This is the first order dominance in terms of C. Okay. So it turns out x f is dx prime if and only if for every poverty line fx is lower than fx prime. So for each poverty line, a lower fx dominates. Right? For quantile function, what did you have? The quantile function have to be greater than equal to, right? It has to be higher. Look at here, for z, the fx has to be lower always. So for first order dominance, that's why this morning I told you that I will revisit it. So for when you are stating the same first order dominance with fx, that means distribution, x, fx dx prime, if and only if fx for a particular income is less than equal to fy, the sign reverses. It has to hold for all b, and for some b, this relation has to straight. So if you have that relation, that means first order stochastic dominance. Now, how strong is the FSD result? It turns out if FSD holds, then there is agreement among all poverty measures I have introduced so far across all poverty lines. So if you have FSD, this kind of situation to start with, and if somebody says, which measure will lead high poverty? So you don't have to ask. First order dominance means all the poverty measures that we discussed so far will agree for all poverty. It does not matter. This is as strong. Okay, it's a very strong result. So whenever you are doing your research in terms of poverty, try to plot these distributions and see if you get dominance results. If you get dominance results, you don't have to worry about poverty measures or poverty lines. Sounds good? Okay. Okay. So let's see. So if you, I think we have already been through it, right? Yeah. Okay. So what happens when two poverty incidence curves cross? I'm not going to go deeper into it, but just for your knowledge, people look at, just like we did in terms of income standard, people look at second order, third order, and so on. So if it crosses, you can go to the second order stochastic dominance, which requires comparing the area under the CDF, not under the quantile function. Yeah, and it is linked to poverty gap measure. If that crosses, you can again compute the area under the second order curve. This is called third order dominance, and it is linked to poverty square gap. Yeah, so the tools exist. I'm not going into details because then I have to go into too much technicalities. I'll be requiring another 2 hours of lecture, unfortunately. Okay, then there is another tool you may be interested in. It's called 3 eyes of poverty curve. In one curve, you summarize head count, gap, and square gap altogether. It was generated by Jenkins and Lambert. Very recently, in 2025, I referred to the paper, and that paper got published in Journal of Econometrics, which is one of the top journals in econometrics. they extended this framework to the multidimensional context or counting approach context that we'll be covering. They call it 3 eyes of deprivation curve. Yeah, but this has just got published in 2025, last month. Yeah, in Journal of Econometrics. Okay. Let's look at now poverty line sensitivity. So if we have this dominance and this beautiful word, fine, we are safe. But what if curves do not cross? What if curves cross and you do not have this dominance kind of results? Well, there are other tools as well that will allow you to conduct poverty line sensitivity. And it can work for income poverty, it may be used for non-income poverty, energy poverty, health poverty, whatever you do in this world. But it's a general concept, but I thought it may be worth discussing here. So if poverty dominance mainly answers whether a distribution has more poverty or less poverty, that's it, nothing else. Yeah. And if they intersect, it is still possible to do partial dominance analysis. In that sense, suppose you have a long curve and they intersect towards the end. And you could say, okay, I'm choosing, say, the middle 20% of income, but for the middle period, you suppose get dominance. People would mostly buy, yes, we are okay. At least you have dominance for this range. You should be okay. Yeah. But even that may not happen. Now, curve may be twisted. Yeah. In general, often it is interest in policy to understand how sensitive is our evaluation to the poverty line. That means if we change the poverty line to a certain percentage, how much our poverty measure will change. Yeah. So you can use the concept of elasticity, which is the percentage change in poverty measured due to 1% change in income, is the growth elasticity of poverty. So suppose you have your headcount ratio, you get, for 10,000, you get 25%. And then for if you change it by another 10,000 to these, 11.2%, however you call it, you change your poverty line. Suppose your poverty index, headcount index changes from 25% to 30%. So you have a 5 percentage point increase or a 20% increase. So you can compute your change, what you expect if you have low elasticity. That means your poverty estimates are more reliable. That means they are not changing much. If they fluctuate quite a lot, then you will say, probably my point estimate is not so reliable. Yeah, that's the idea.
So now, with regard to that percentage change in poverty, then what is the basic parameter which we will take into account? Like to measure the elasticity, we measure the percentage change in the poverty with regard to either change in income or growth.
Change in income, changing. Say for you are doing it for a country, for India. So you say, okay, India poverty line is say 30 rupees per day, and you get a headcount ratio, right? Then you are saying, okay, if I change the poverty line by 10%, 32 rupees per day, how much is my poverty changing? Now, suppose you get your poverty, for example, this particular example is saying we have an increase of 12.5% rise in poverty line is leading to 20% rise in poverty. It's a lot, right? You change. So if you get 10% change in your poverty line and your headcount ratio changes by 30%, it's a big change, right? So you have to be really careful. But suppose you see that I change my poverty line by 10%, my headcount ratio changes by 2%. Fine, then it's more reliable. Yeah.
So there is no way to like something has to change to a certain extent.
Are you asking for rule of thumb?
Yes.
I have not come across. I mean, I don't believe in rule of thumb, first of all, but these are tools people use. It's all value judgment. Sometimes you say, elasticity of 1 would be acceptable. Sometimes people say, 0.5 should be more. Very difficult to come up with a particular number. And I don't want to fall in the trap of value judgment. I don't want to dictate. But it's totally up to you what you consider sort of acceptable. But whatever you do, give them more than one figure, not just one. Yeah. Look at 10, 5%, 10%, and see how much it is changing and so on. So the elasticity here, you can see 20% divided by 12.5% is nearly 1.6. more than 1. Some may say, yeah, it's pretty high. Yep. Problem with elasticity, poverty measurement, is that growth is unbounded. GDP is unbounded. So your growth can take any value, right? But your poverty measure is a bounded one. So if you are very close to poverty, you cannot have a large reduction in poverty anyway. So sometimes when you take percentage, that means divide by the existing poverty, you always do not get the right figure. So sometimes you have to look at the absolute change as well. And that takes you to the world of semi-elasticity. Yeah. So you can use elasticity and semi-elasticity. So lower elasticity means policy reliable estimate. Now I do not want to set a threshold here. Yeah. So how is poverty and growth related, and what kind of tools we can use? Growth definitely doesn't always lead to poverty reduction or the poverty reduction the way you want. Yeah. Let us take an example. So suppose we have this distribution 8, 10, 18, and 24. Average is 15. If you take the average of these 4 numbers, you get 15. Yeah. Suppose you have 2 timelines. You have a red timeline and you have blue timeline. In red timeline, suppose in both timelines actually, your average changes to 24. What is the rate of growth here? 15 to 24? Around 60%, right? So 60% growth. Now suppose you have a poverty line of 12. And this is how the distribution turned out. So in red situation, distribution is 8, 10, 20, 50. And in another situation is 18, 18, 26, 34. You have same growth and look very different poverty trajectories. Which trajectory has lower poverty? The blue one, right? There you go. The same growth, but different poverty trajectory. Now, change in growth is of course due to poverty line. So what we do here, it's called growth elasticity. So you had one elasticity concept that I showed you. It was elasticity with respect to the poverty line itself. This one is growth elasticity of poverty. Yeah. So growth elasticity poverty is similar. Percentage change in P due to 1% change in per capita income. So this is your growth, 1% growth. And then you are saying that due to 1% growth, how much my poverty has changed. Yeah. Same elasticity concept can be used here. In general, if this value is greater than 1, then growth has resulted in larger reduction in poverty in relative terms. And if this is less than 1, then of course growth has resulted in a smaller relative reduction in poverty. Now, the problem that I was discussing above, let me just go back one slide. Sorry. This is the elasticity. The problem with elasticity, when you look at the percentage change, as I told you, that poverty indices are bounded. So whether when you are dividing it by the actual poverty level, whether it is high level of poverty or low level of poverty can distort that relative change. Yeah. So what is suggested also to look at the growth semi-elasticity of poverty. So here you have absolute change in poverty. Here you have percentage change in per capita income. Yeah. So this has been used by various other examples. So in poverty elasticity, in growth elasticity of poverty in literature, you will see both elasticity, which is more of the relative concept, and you also see semi-elasticity. Now, this concept is not just for income poverty, they can be used for multidimensional poverty, because what if you want to know change in per capita income, but change in multidimensional poverty? So you can use the same concept. We will be covering, we have a tutorial session where we will be covering more about how we used to use this elasticity concept in multidimensional context. Okay, let's now talk a little bit about growth incidence curve, how this growth incidence curve can be used to understand whether a change in poverty situation has been pro-poor or not. Okay, You have heard about the situation pro-poor, right? People call pro-poor growth, whether the growth has benefited poor or not. Yeah. How we can use this growth incidence curve. So what is a growth incidence curve? For growth incidence curve, suppose we denote the growth in the average by G bar, and it denotes the growth of quantile incomes between Y and X at percentage points. So this growth incidence curve is actually computing the growth of every percentile income. So you divide the entire population into 100 equal groups, yeah, and then you have the quantile function, right? So you have a quantile function of period 1 and you have a quantile function of period 2, right? And you are computing the growth at every percentile. So that can give you a growth incidence curve. Now, growth incidence can be linked to poverty incidence. How? So, if a poverty line is fixed, if the growth incidence curve is positive and downward sloping throughout, what does it mean? Let me show you when I draw the graph that headcount ratio should be going down. Yeah? How does it work? So this is, suppose this is your growth of the mean. Okay? And suppose we are plotting this growth of quantile incomes for every quantile, every percentile here, right? So it is the distance, relative distance between two percentiles. And suppose you have a growth incidence like this, growth incidence curve like this. What does it mean? It means this is the average growth of the average. Yeah. Growth of the bottom 1%, growth of the bottom 3%, growth of the bottom 3 percentile, 4 percentile, and so on. Now, if a curve is downward sloping, what does it mean? The poorer has faster growth or slower growth? Again, some said faster, who said slower? And again, if you did not understand, let me explain again. So this is the poorest 1%, poorest 2%, poorest 3%, and so on, right? And you have the richest ones over here. And what we are doing, we are computing the growth for each percentile. So this growth incidence curve is falling. What does it mean? Is the poorer has more growth or richer has more growth? The poorer has more growth, right? So now, if this is positive and poorer has more growth, can I claim that the headcount ratio actually has gone down?
Yes.
Right? So growth incidence curve. So if you have this kind of situation, this is called a pro-poor growth. That means you have a growth, but look, the poorer, they have actually grown faster than the average growth. That is pro-poor. Here you have the richer, they actually have grown, but their growth is lower than the average. So if you plot the growth incidence curve, that means you compute the growth. Then if you go to World Bank website, World Bank has this growth curves for different countries. So you can literally see whether this country has a pro-poor growth in the period of 5 years or 6 years. Yeah. So if you have this kind of growth, I can easily claim that this is pro-poor growth and definitely benefited the poor. In relative terms, there is the other catch, rightist approach. But still, even within the rightist framework, you could say that poorer has grown faster. If you have this kind of growth curve, growth incidence curve, what does it mean? Poorer has grown much slower. Look at the growth of the rich, much faster. So the main growth of the country has come. So people can look at growth, but where the growth is coming from is very important. So instead of just plotting the growth, you can plot the growth of the quantile function itself. That gives you an entire curve that helps you to understand where the growth has come from. Similarly, you can look at the growth of the Lorenz curve as well. Generalized Lorenz curve. Generalized Lorenz curve, what it does, at each point, it is the average income, lower partial mean of that bottom 3%, bottom 10, bottom 20, bottom 30, and so on. You can again try to plot. This is the growth of the average. and if you have this growth, always the generalized Lorentz, this point will always coincide because the highest point of the generalized Lorentz is the mean itself. So as a result, the highest point of the generalized Lorentz will always coincide with this one also. You see the lower partial means are growing much faster here. If you have this kind of situation, bottom average income of the bottom 1%, look, this is the growth. Average income of the bottom 2%, look at this is the growth. They're growing much faster than the average. But then, if you have another kind of curve like this is anti-poor because it is the bottom 1%, bottom 2%, and so on. They have grown much slower than the average. So you can use this kind of concepts to understand pro-poorness of growth. Make sense? Yeah. I have to check my own time. Given that Pratap is not here, we have plenty of time. It's fine. Let's talk about a bit on poverty line. How the poverty line is set. As I told you, there is no one single criteria to define a poverty line. Yeah. So poverty line depends on the purpose that you are using. It can change from country to country, situation to situation. Ideally, different Indian states should have different poverty lines. They should not have the same poverty line. Yeah. Typically, there are three types of poverty line. One is absolute. What is absolute? It is generally said you come with some criterion, and this criterion generates the poverty line, and the only change you have is just the inflation adjustments. Yeah. So suppose somebody decides, okay, those who living in rural areas, what is the calorie requirement now in India for rural? Anyone? 2400. 2400. And in urban? 21. Okay. So 2400 and 2100. How scientifically valid is it? It is. Why it is not 2420? Why it is not 2379? It is 2400. Does it vary from the size of the person? Does it vary across gender? So you can see a lot of arbitrariness there already. But suppose 2400 is something we agree on, it has been determined by scientific committee, fine. Some scientists have decided, some biologists. Yeah. The next step is that based on that, you say, okay, what kind of commodity basket is going to give you that calorie per day? You have probably 180 commodities, right? Has anyone computed directly from NSS? How many baskets have you used? I know Pratap will be covering, Pratap was here. But whatever you do, you have all these 270, 80 commodities, you use them to come out a figure. Now, you can have questions. Well, does your body translate in the same way? Does everybody's body translate in the same way? Maybe not. Somehow we use that to come up with that figure 30 rupees per day. Okay, it's not set in stone. But then that 30 rupees, how does that change? That changes from per year, you know. Okay, here is a story for you. So when we constructed this multidimensional poverty index in 2010, the figure came out to be somewhere around 53.7%. Figure. At that, and we used the inflation data of 2005-6. At that point of time, the closest NSS data was 2004-5. And for that data, the income poverty, the consumption expenditure poverty rate was 27%, which was exactly the half of what we got. So the Indian government and the ministry, they were not very happy about it. They're saying, are you making a joke? Because how can it be double than what we have just released? Okay, then the committee report came out. 2009. They changed the poverty basket. They computed the poverty rate again. I think it was a rural poverty that changed. I do not exactly remember, but the total poverty figure increased for the same 2004-5 data set, increased from 27 to 37%. Rangarajan report came out. 2011. It was recomputed. And the figure increased for the same 2004-5 to 45%. So it was converging to the 53.7 figure we got for multidimensional poverty. Who knows? There has not been another committee, but if another committee is appointed and it is computed from, you will get 55% around that. So, whatever poverty line you say, they are arbitrary, they are challenges. Developing countries, mainly, they tend to use absolute poverty lines because it is easier to show that your poverty has fallen. Because the only adjustment you do is your inflationary factor. Developed country, most Europe, for example, America does not. USA does not. Developed OECD countries uses their poverty line as 60% of median income. So that means if the median income is changing, your poverty line is increasing by 60% of it. Okay? So absolute poverty line is, this is how it is said. If you look at $1.9 a day, it is based on a regression framework, or $1 a day. You have the countries, you feed a regression, and you see where that regression line, the intercept hits the axis. That's your minimum amount required. $1 a day poverty line never went to the field and asked people in poor countries, is $1 enough for you? It was decided with a computer generated feedback regression technique. And this is how they're operated over time. Okay? So that's where I would not use $1 a day for my own research, typically. Yeah. There's a lot of arbitrariness, but whatever poverty line you use, they will have some form of arbitrariness. The main reason for $1 a day is for international comparisons. National policies should not be set with $1 a day, $1.9 a day. Yeah. Relative poverty, on the other hand, the main basic argument comes from Atkinson's work is that whether people can participate in the society. So that means people's income, the minimum threshold should change with the increase in income of the society. They took median income as a representative income and set the poverty line as a certain percentage of median income. Now, if you follow that practice in India, the poverty reduction will be much lower because your poverty line has to change. It will not remain 30 rupees per month anymore. Who knows, it will become 120 rupees or something like that. Yeah, it will change quite a lot. If you do that, it will be very difficult for Indian government to show that poverty has actually gone down. Yeah. Then there is something called a hybrid poverty line, because absolute poverty line has its own problem. It doesn't change over time much. Relative poverty has its own problem. It changes too much, too fast. Yeah. If you think of you have a distribution neutral growth. That means a government is able to increase everybody's income by 50%. Every person's income has gone up by 50%. If that happens, median will also change by 50%, right? Poverty line will also change by 50%, right? In the end, there will be no change in poverty. That's another extreme. So that's why some people have suggested, why don't we look at something in the middle? It's called the hybrid poverty line. So you take the absolute income component, absolute poverty line, you take the relative poverty line, and you find something in the middle. The approach varies. Yeah. So Foster proposed an approach in 1998, and they said that, look, elasticity of absolute poverty, it doesn't change. So elasticity of poverty line with respect to any income standard is zero. You take the income standard of median. If median is changing, does absolute poverty change? No. If you adjust it for inflation, change in median is there, absolute poverty line remains fixed. So no change in absolute poverty line. So the elasticity of poverty line with respect to an income standard is zero. On the other hand, the elasticity of a relative poverty line to an income standard is 100%, is 1. Two extremes, right? Why don't we find something in the middle? So relative poverty line elasticity 1, too much responsive. So he proposed something like a Cobb-Douglas function. So you have a relative poverty line, an absolute poverty line, and then rho is the elasticity parameter, sorry, the convex combination is the parameter, it's elasticity parameter as well. It lies between 0 and 1. So for absolute, elasticity is 0. For relative, elasticity is 1. If you set rho somewhere in the middle, then the elasticity is between 0 and 1. It could be one approach to setting poverty line for a country. You do not make it completely elastic, you do not make it zero elastic, but somewhere in the middle. Okay, this is analogous to, if you want to see, it is analogous to the Cobb-Douglas function, it is analogous to a geometric mean, however you want to see it. Yeah. So the interpretation of rho is, it is the elasticity of the poverty line with respect to the income. You can set it, again the question again would be, where do I set it? Well, fine, you choose it at 0.5, you choose it at 0.6, it's totally up to you. Or you can show a range and conduct robustness analysis. It's all fine in research. So if rho tends to 0, then ZH becomes less and less response to income standard. And if ZH and its rho goes to 1, it becomes more sensitive. Now, Atkinson and Bourguignon proposed a different approach. What did they do? They said that we denote the income standard respect to which poverty line will be set by WM, which could be mean or median. But then they suggest, a poverty line could be, you take the value, this is the absolute poverty line, and this is, suppose 60% of the median income. So your poverty line should be whichever is the maximum of these two. If the absolute poverty line is higher than the relative poverty line, then absolute poverty line is your poverty line. But then, if your relative poverty line becomes larger than absolute poverty line, then you have a relative poverty line as your poverty line. So your poverty line will look like something like this. Yeah, let me see if I have the graph for you. So the absolute poverty line is larger than the relative, then absolute poverty line should prevail. And if relative poverty line is larger, then that's one. But in general, if the relative poverty line is larger, then it is going to prevail, and they did some regression estimate, and they found, using the World Bank data, that K to be found for this particular year was 0.37. This one. But these are, again, academic estimates. They can vary if you change the data sets and year, etc. But then Chin and Ravelian proposed a weekly poverty line because they also observed that for Atkinson and Bourguignon, this elasticity was either 0 or 1 because they had an absolute part and relative part. For the absolute part, elasticity was 0, but for relative part, the elasticity was 1. They said, okay, we see if we can have another approach, more intuitive approach, so that the elasticity is between 0 and 1. So what they did, they added another term here, another positive term over here. Yeah, so alpha is greater than 0. In addition to this Atkinson-Bourguignon term, and this made the elasticity to be somewhere between 0 and 1. Let me show you. So for Atkinson and Bourguignon was this one. Yeah, so it went like this, and then you had the relative over here. Yeah, and this line was passing through the origin like this. So for what Ravelian and Chin suggested, that instead of starting from the center, you have it like this, but you have an added term over alpha here, because if this one is going to the origin, for this part it is either 0, and for this part it is 1. But given that Ravelian and Chin added an intercept term, for this part it is 0, but for this part it is less than 1. So that was the typical idea how to change. This is called a weakly relative poverty line. You may see World Bank using them in the near future. Yeah. Now, how should we determine poverty line in practice? $1 million question. I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone will ever have an answer. Yeah. But let's see how people do in general, what are the arguments they have. So our answer should be, as an economist, we always say it depends. And it really depends on the situation. Yeah. So if you are interested in global poverty measurement, you have certain parameters that you have to keep in mind. You need to ensure that you have the same commodity basket for every country, because if you have two different commodity baskets for two different countries, their poverty estimates cannot be compared. So you will be limited by the commodity baskets. So you have to choose same commodity basket for all countries. Think of it. If you are comparing, say, forget about two countries, if you are comparing Rajasthan and say West Bengal, in one place you need more water. Scarcity of water is a big problem. In West Bengal, that is not. And if you are using similar kind of requirement for these two states, they are not comparable. Okay, we have this kind of perfectly comparable situation is also not possible. So here, whenever you are now, I just gave you the example of two states within one country. Now think about all the countries, all the developing countries. You are limited by that set of commodity basket. Purchasing power parity adjustment you have to do, otherwise they are not comparable. And again, different commodity baskets, of course, is not possible when you are computing the consumption, aggregate consumption expenditure. If you are talking about national poverty assessment, you need to consider, the country's need, climate, preference. Same thing. If you are developing something for Jammu Kashmir versus you are developing something for Kerala, they have a completely different climate. They have a completely different need. And that's why we feel that every state should have their own poverty line. The problem is, then when the national government is designing the policy, budget sharing, one state is asking more budget. I said, oh, your poverty, you are not even comparable. How are you asking? On what basis you are asking? So you see, there is a trade-off. So you can define different poverty lines for different countries, for different states, different commodity basket, but the central government will have very difficult time in sharing revenues. So you have trade-offs. That's why I said it's not possible to completely solve it, but we always have to find a middle ground. Yeah. And of course, there is developing versus developed country. One poverty line, global poverty line, has never been used for all countries. The $1 a day, $2.5 a day, they are developing country poverty lines. Even when I covered a little bit, even when UNDP developed Human Poverty Index in 1990s, they had one for developed countries, one for developing countries. So there has not been any poverty line that applied to all countries at the same time. It has never been done, and I don't think it is ever going to be done. Yeah, they capture different things. And of course, you have the idea of absolute, relative, and all these things. Okay, how much time do I have in front of that? It's tracking. Okay. Okay. So before we end today, and I will leave some time in the end for Q&A. I know you got tired too. Let's talk a bit about equivalence scales. Have you heard about equivalence scales? Any of you? No? Okay. It's new then. You. I bet some of you have used it in your research. So we most of the time use per capita income, right? Or per capita expenditure. Yep. Does every household member require or need the same level of resources? Yes or no? No? Yes? Okay. How do you adjust for that? That's where the adult equivalence or equivalence scales come into picture. Yeah. So does everybody in the household require income or expenditure required equally? Now it has two sides. People should not use it to discriminate against someone. Yeah. So let's have some rational understanding. Question: the amount of food that an adult eats, would a 4-year child eat the same amount? Maybe not. Yeah. That's sort of the arguments why equivalence scales are used. So just does the child consume the same amount of as adult? Of course, you give the answer no. Is it same when one person lives in a household as when 3 persons share the house? if a one person living in a house, would you say 5 people exactly requires 5 times the house of that when one single person house? No. In one house, you can have one TV. In a 6-person house, you do not have 6 TVs. Right? One person, you have one bathroom, 6 people, maximum 2 bathrooms, 3 bathrooms, not 6 bathrooms. So there's some economies of scale. So sometimes people say they should be adjusted. Yeah, let's see what kind of difference it can make. Okay, so these are the communities that you can see within a house can be seen as public goods in the context of the household members. They share, right? To heat the room. If you have 6 people, doesn't mean you need 6 times the energy to heat the house. Yeah. Okay. So how to adjust for these scales? There are 2 prevailing, well-known household scales. Again, they have their arbitrariness. As a researcher, whenever you are using your scale, you should conduct robustness tests. Yeah. The first one is the OECD scale. What does it do? So it defines the scale as 1 plus 0.7. NA is the number of adults minus 1 plus 0.5 NC, which is the number of children. Okay. Suppose you have one adult member. What will AEOECD be equal to? Suppose you have one adult household member in a house. What would be the value of OECD? 1 plus, this is 1. This is, and there is NC is 0. This is equal to 1. So you will be dividing by 1. What if 2 adult people are living in the house? 1.7. So you are not dividing by 2, you are going to be dividing by 1.7. What if there are a single mother living with 2 kids, 2 children? 1 adult, 2 children. The value will be 1 adult, 2 children. Value of 2. So you are not going to be dividing by 3, you will be dividing by 2. Does it make sense? So that is OECD equivalence scale. There is a World Bank LSMS equivalence scale. Yeah. So this 0.7 here on the left hand side, 0.7 captures the economies of scale. So if you increase the number of adults, they do not increase by 1, but they keep on increase by 0.7. And this is the children component. Every child is considered half in requirement as an adult. This is World Bank. They use a slightly different kind of scale and they use that formulation. NA is the number of adults, NC is the number of children, but then rho is adult equivalent for children, and mu, the term V, is for median. This one captures economies of scale.
How it can be decided?
Sorry?
Scale to be decided.
World Bank, OECD, they come with their estimates, but I always show caution because I don't believe in a point estimate. So you have to compare for a range of values. This is what my guidance suggestion. Yeah. So NA is the number. For example, here you are saying is 0.5. It may not be true. And also, you need more brackets 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on. This is very simplified, and this is mainly for so that policymakers can understand. But for your own research, you have to have more divisions and so on. They do not adjust for disabled people, right? They do not adjust for elderly. Nothing. No adjustment. It's very simple, very simplified version. But you get the main concept. Once you get the main concept, you can create your own equivalence scale. Yeah. For LSMS, what we do, you have the adult, you have the number of children. Rho is the cost of a child compared to adult. And then V is the effect of economies of scale. If you have the value of 1, then you assume no equivalence scale. Yeah, otherwise it should be less than 1. So these are the 2 prevalent equivalence scale. Let's look at an example. Yeah, the next slide. I hope I have the example for you. Yeah, I have. So consider this example. So the per capita, the adjusted welfare aggregate for each household is computed as the total income of the household, but instead of dividing by the total number of members, you divide by adult equivalent. Let's see how difference it can make in practice. So suppose we have two households, each has income of 24,000. Yeah. So if you do typical per capita, it is going to be depending on the household member. Okay, so household A, you have 3 adult members. So if you use AEOECD, you have 3 adults. That means you have 1 plus 0.7 times 2. So you will get 2.4. So adult equivalent per capita income is going to be 24,000 divided by 2.4, actually 10,000. Okay. Now suppose household B, which has 1 adult and 2 children. Its adult equivalent is going to be 1 plus 0.5 times 2, so only 2. So adult equivalent per capita is going to be 12,000. If you just simply divide by 3, the number of which is usually done, then your adult your per capita is 8,000. So if your poverty line is 9,000, if you just divide it by 3, then this person's household is poor. But if you adjust for adult equivalent, they are not poor. So you can see it can make a big difference. And that's why you have to be precise as well. For your own research, you need to be very precise. You probably need to adjust for much larger age groups, gender, disability, and all these things. So your adult equivalent is very perfect. It itself is an area of research, adult equivalent skills. What kind of adult equivalent skills?
So can you adjust it for poverty line as well? Absolute
So
poverty.
if you go to US government website,
Okay.
US government's poverty line exactly adjust for, so they do not have one poverty line. So they have a poverty line for single adult household. They have a poverty line with 1 adult, 1 single child. They have a poverty line for 2 adult and 3 children. So they have different poverty line. This is how they adjust. So they don't have a per capita poverty line. So they adjust and then they have different. So if you go to visit US government poverty lines, you will be able to see those different poverty lines. Yep. So how much minimum? So when you are computing this, is it probably you decide, okay, say in urban rural, we already have the differences, right? 20,400 versus 18. You can try to do the same thing for children of different ages, gender, and so on. Very difficult. It's not an easy task, as I said. It itself is an area of research. But if you try to do that, well, that can give you a more complete adult equivalent scale. And then, of course, it begs the question: how much difference in result you get, whether you use that adult equivalent scale or not. But here you can clearly see it's different. The same income, 2,400. If you divide it by 3, you will get 8,000 for both households. But if you adjust for adult equivalence as well as economies of scale, you get slightly different pictures. Food for thought. Martin Rebellion probably had a paper where he adjusts for this adult equivalent, because if you do that adult equivalent, because in general, in most of the poverty analysis, we see larger households are poorer. If we have adult equivalent here, will the picture change? There's a paper by Martin Rebellion, which was done late 90s or something like that. But there are people who are working in adult equivalent scale. It's important. Sounds good? Well, I think that is the last slide for today. Yeah, so I finished with 10 minutes at hand, I think. Do you have, I know you're tired, but still, do you have any question? Any particular question from the content that I just covered?
So one question about why gender distinction is not made in terms of adult equivalence.
Why?
Gender, gender in the.
Oh, they should. They should. But I mean,
it is difficult to measure it.
Very difficult. And how to do? There may not be any one criteria. Not only gender, as I said, disability, different kind of health problems, their size, their body mass index. I remember one of my colleagues is 6 feet 6 inch long, and he was taking a snack at 5 o'clock. I would probably take some tea and biscuits, you know. And he was having snacks, and I asked him, "You are having snacks now?" He said, "Look at my body size. I need more food." So there are different ways, but at the same time, you ought to be careful that the same criteria should not be used against people. For example, if you have more children, you just use, oh, you have a children, it doesn't matter if your children has big requirement or whatever, your children, that means we will adjust and you are not poor. They can be used against them as well. So there are two sides as well. Yeah. So you have got to be very careful when you are defining, because they have policy, because some people may not be identified as poor only because of equivalent scale adjustment. So you have to take all of these into account, because you have practical implications on people's life, and poverty is about people's life. So it is not an easy decision to make. But it is good to know what is out there and what is done rather than not knowing them. Yeah.
So it's not only the demographic composition which has been changing. Along with that, the type of occupation which the different states is at. Moving to the northeastern states, but the type of occupation where the northeastern ladies have been involved with, it's totally different in comparison to the northern India, in comparison to the southern India. In that sense, the poverty computation in those regions should be different as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So
the social group wise also.
absolutely different people. If you look at the tribal region, if you look at other regions, they have different kind of requirement. It should be adjusted. As I said, Rajasthan would be requiring more water. Water is in a crisis point compared to other states which has rivers. So there are various things. You will never be able to find a perfect equivalence there. There will always be issues. But at least sometimes people opt for a bit of imperfection rather than not being able to find out devise the perfect situation. Yeah, it's not possible. But at least if you do that small adjustment, you different picture same out, and probably it's worth looking at that.
No, but in case of India, we are not even bothered about the adaptive equivalence. Nobody is going.
No, because look, there is a situation. Okay, let me tell you a story. Because I was teaching it was in Amman, the Jordanian statistical team that I was teaching about on multidimensional poverty. So we started with single dimensional measurement, right? And I was talking about the same way, the head count, poverty gap, and they were the policymakers, right? And I was asking them that question: you are the policymaker, what do you do? And of course, I didn't tell about corruption, that you keep the money in your pocket. I cannot say that. But anyway, the chief statistician said, Shimon, it's very good in class. I myself took economics, I understand what you're saying. If I go to my boss, who happens to be the minister of finance, who has to earn votes, if I ask him and explain headcount ratio, he will say, yes, I will go and talk public. If I talk about poverty gap, he will say, no, I'm listening to you, but I'm not going to convey the problem. And if I start talking about poverty gap, square poverty gap, you just kick me out of this office. You will not even pay attention and listen. So you have to keep in mind, measure poverty or whatever discussion we do, we have one side where we have technicalities that we researchers must not. But then, of course, we have a policy side where people are making difference on the ground. Unless the communication is clear, many very good proposals will be lost. So they do not always translate to policy. So the combining these two things, they're very important. Now you have to understand OECD, they're working with all these countries, right? More complex they make, countries will say, I'm not using it. US, LSMS, they are dealing with developing countries, right? If they make it too complex, developing countries will say, we are not, although it is important, they will not see very implement. So, as researchers, should you give up? You should never give up. Our objective is to try to get to that truth as much as possible, however complicated it is. We cannot always think about whether it will be implemented by the government or not. We should try to get as close as possible, but our objective is not only that. Our objective is to get to the truth. Does it make a difference? Yes, you can try to devise, you can make it state-wise. As I said, every state should have their own poverty line, but the other side is that central government will come and say, how am I going to distribute resources? So you have both sides. But you do not give up your investigations. Okay? You have to keep on trying, finding, and by doing this, hopefully you will find a solution that is communicable. But communicability is a big problem.
Instead of all those poverty lines, don't you think that the median income poverty line could have been like below 50% and below 60%? That could have been.
You are assuming that there is another point. It is under the assumption that you have a very accurate estimate of the median income. Do you? Income we do not know because we do not have tax records. Still, you guys are working in India. What fraction of population pay tax, income tax? For how many people do we have tax record, verifiable tax record? What fraction? Anyone? At some point, 20 years ago, it was 3%. Has it changed much? 7 to 8%. There you go. So even the median income consumption expenditure, if you say, was 2017-18 report released? No, right? Second, surveyors these days, they say that you go to survey a household, you meet their dogs. They don't even, the response rate, the attrition, the dropout rate is massive, non-response rate is massive. So even if you use consumer expenditure survey, you do not get the exact accurate picture. How would you set the poverty line where you are affecting people's life? How are you going to base on that median income, which is not even accurate? So you see, there are different flaws on practice if you want to try. If we can't measure those things, that's where measurement and data becomes so important. And then there you go, we didn't have a census in 2021. So it is very important that we all opt for and push for better data. Because unless we have better data, we cannot run and better measurement techniques. We cannot do analysis. How is forget about doing poverty? Right?
Does this hybrid method which you have mentioned satisfy all those properties which
It is a poverty line. The properties are for aggregation methods. So it's not going to make any difference. Poverty line is a poverty line. Poverty line is given. So all those assumptions are based on a given poverty line. So whether that $10 poverty line is from hybrid, relative, yes, certain things may change because poverty line will keep on changing when you are changing things. I don't think you can adjust, minor adjustment with the assumptions and properties. It's not a problem. Any other questions? So I think Pratap will post an assessment, an assignment exercise. It's not assignment, it's exercise for your practice. There'll be 4 questions you will see, and they will be based on what we have covered today. Yeah. Try to do them in your evening. You don't have to do it by yourself. You just can just work together. It's not an assessment. But of course, your final day assessment may borrow some concepts onto exercises as well as lectures. Yeah. Try to solve them. I have designed them in a way so that it helps you to understand some of the materials that if I didn't expect you to understand all 4 hours of materials just in one go. So that exercises will help. And if you understand some of the concepts, what we covered today better, then it will help you in the next day, the short module, right? Pratap will post the assigned answer keys as well, but at night. So that you try yourself first, and then Pratap will eventually send the answer key as well. Tomorrow morning, we should be available here from 9:30 onwards. Our lecture will start at 10, but we'll be available 9:30 onwards. If you have any questions, either from your exercises or from forward today, I'll be happy to respond to or answer. Sounds good?